Okay, so today we're going to get into China, kind of a whirlwind 20th century approach to it, where it's like, hey, we're making changes, and then no, and then they're kind of back, and it's a lot of stuff that goes on. So let's get right to it. So when last we left off, if we see the map on the right here, you get the massive impact of colonialism, in which you have all these different countries with influence in China, and you had the Opium War, and then there was the Boxer Rebellion to try to take over, and then that just basically got smashed, and to the point where China kind of controlled this area, and then of course um, the emperor is kind of doing their own thing in the Forbidden City, and it's really just not particularly good. And that is going to change. So in the late 1800s, you had the Empress Cixi, who basically was destroying everything. Now, whereas she was in control of stuff, particularly her little boy, the Emperor Puyu, who would come right after her, she was living a life of extravagance. She helped to organize the Boxer Rebellion, but then like left them all out to die. She was not particularly the nicest of people until finally you get 1911. The emperor is overthrown. Now, Pu is just a little boy. He was removed from power. He was only about 5 or 6. Now, he would go on to live kind of like a normal life for the rest of his life, but he was gone. And as a result, you had the creation of a Republican style government that was led by that man on the bottom, Sun Yat Sen. And the idea was to slowly but surely get China free from European domination and to do it in a way without bloodshed. And it was successful. You did start to have the removal of like Britain and France and stuff like that. China would trade and things like that, although they still weren't able to quite get on with getting Hong Kong, but that's going to come much later. And everything seemed to be going pretty well. And then, unfortunately, corruption would set in. After Sun Yat sen, you just had a lot of what we would call like cronyism and kind of things along that line, and lots of bribery, still a lot of foreign influence, and everything slowly but surely starts to kind of fall apart. And as a result, you are going to get a civil war. And on the one side, you would have Mao Zedong, there's a young Mao there, who would lead the communists. Now, of course, they're going to be helped out by the Soviets, who had just a few years earlier than this come into power. We are now in the very early 1930s here, and Mao Zedong would be faced by a man by the name of Chiang Kai shek, who would lead what were known as the Nationalists. He was not a particularly nice guy, very famous in the United States of America, and he would be supported by us for the sole reason of him not being communist. Yes, we've talked about us supporting not so good people before, and once again, we're going to have another one here. So the U.S. is going to be in support of him. And this war would rage on for quite a long time. Um, Early on, the communists were being constantly pushed back, and you have an event that was known as the Long March, in which, after a series of defeats, the communists are able to continue to like flee and then hide and fight a small battle and hide. And as a result, they would actually march a total of 6,176 miles and start to get some victories. Many people were kind of endeared to them mainly because of their um, success and fighting off a rather corrupt force, which was led by um, Chiang Kai shek. Now, we would get a timeout with World War II, and we talked a lot about the Japanese destruction and how horrible that was. But after the war, things would reconvene, and in 1949, the communists would win. And at that point, you get the rule of Mao Zedong. This is horrible in just about every possible way that you could imagine. On the bottom there, you see children reading what became known as the Little Red Book, which was kind of this guidebook to success. On the top right, you see Mao burning symbols of the past, which is pretty much common for what dictators do. And he actually had this own statue of him being built. And I think you've noticed over time, if you see people building giant monuments to themselves, they're probably not the best of people. Now, what ends up happening first was what Mao referred to as the Great Leap Forward. The idea of the Great Leap Forward was collectivization, very similar to what Stalin did, and the idea that you're going to use the farm workers, as you see them in the front here. You see how all these farm workers, they're going to lead everything. You see a dude flying on a missile, you know you've got a problem here. This is almost very modern day North Korea-ish. The idea that they're going to develop these massive weapons and a massive army. And dude, they do develop nukes, so it works. The problem is this will end up destroying China because a series of famines hit in 1959 to 1962. The economy can no longer sustain it. Everything gets thrown into this modernization of building like weapons and all that type of stuff. But the fact of the matter is there's not much industry going on here either. You're really, really starting to see kind of the destruction of society because farm collectivization does not work. You push the land, and then the land pushes back and you get famine. These are some pictures of the 1959 to 1962 famine. You see the children. You see children here just starving on the streets. It's just horrible. Okay. Now, the other thing here, I'm jumping around a little bit, but the other thing here you have was the Cultural Revolution. Make sure you write that down, the Cultural Revolution. The idea of making China great and that only Chinese things should be supported by China, and that if you don't follow his rules, he's basically going to kill you. He executes millions of people because the idea is everything, it's almost going back to like the Ming and shutting China off, and we're going to build our own economy, we're going to do our own thing. But he breaks the country. They have no actual industry. They're over farming on the land. All dissidents are being thrown in jail. And on here, you have a very interesting thing. And you can look at, it's a chart in which it shows how many people that these guys are responsible for the deaths of. And just to look at here, Hitler is number 3. Leopold II of Belgium, remember he's the guy that was cutting little kids' hands off and stuff. Hideki Tojo, he was the military leader in Japan that did all that crazy stuff in China during World War II. Kim Il Sung, he's the leader of North Korea. Well, a couple goes Pol Pot, going to talk about him. This was the guy that basically was responsible for killing all the people in Armenia. But look at Mao Zedong. I mean, we have estimates at 30 to 50 million people that were killed by this guy. So China starts off the century, quote unquote, on that up. Everything's getting better. We're making our changes. And then Mao comes in and he basically annihilates everything. And then in the 70s, he dies and there is much rejoicing. This is actually a famous picture, series of pictures that was done by Andy Warhol, kind of bringing attention to Mao and the things that he was doing. Now, things are going to change, though, in the 70s with the election, if you will, of Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping was crucial for the survival of China. He is going to massively revamp their economic policies and basically starting to bring in aspects of trade as well as capitalism and letting many businesses come in and set up factories and things along that line. Now, understand this, however, there is still very strict control. You are not speaking out against anybody in China. That's not how that is going to go. But he completely changes their economic system, and as a result, China is kind of like communist, kind of, sorta, but it really allows China to start to recover and develop the economy they have today, which is the largest growing economy in the world. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't dissidence. China controls its people through, in many cases, fear and violence. And in 1989, communist governments across the world were falling apart. And so what ends up happening is many students and young people gather in Tiananmen Square in Beijing to protest for a Republican Democratic style government. Now, in Eastern Europe, governments were falling all over the place. The Soviet Union fell down, but in China, that would not be the case. Now, I'm going to talk over this a little bit here.
Every year, on June 4th, thousands of people rally throughout China in remembrance of the 1989 violent government crackdown. To this day, the Chinese government refuses to acknowledge the event and any information about it is blocked from the internet and public record.
You actually can't catch
So
it
what
on
happened?
Google.
Here's a timeline of the Tiananmen Square massacre. Chinese Cultural Revolution leads to the persecution of millions and encourages a cult of personality around communist leader Mao Zedong. A publicly progressive but politically controversial official, Hu Yabang, dies. Subsequent memorials become hotbeds of citizen dissatisfaction with the communist regime. An editorial in the official Communist Party newspaper seeks to end student protests by warning that they are detrimental to the success of the country. The editorial backfires and strengthens the resolve of protest groups. Tiananmen Square draws an estimated 1.2 million people for an anti-government rally. In response, the government imposes martial law. Soldiers open fire on unarmed student protesters. The death toll is disputed, but unofficial estimates place it as high as several thousand. About 10,000 protesters are arrested. Chinese tanks make their way down the middle of Tiananmen Square and are stopped by an unidentified man standing in front of them. His actions are still used to represent non-violent government rebellion.
If I go back a little bit, and that was the most incredible thing right there. This man, you see all these tanks are coming in, and he actually ends up climbing up on the tanks. Now, there's two things on what happened today. Some people feel that he was actually captured and executed by the government. Others do not. But this is what people speaking out against the government up are against. This guy with shopping bag versus tanks.
Non-violent government rebellion. It's been 26 years since the 1989 Tiananmen Square violence, and there are still protests happening against the Chinese government. The 2011 pro-democracy protests and the 2014 riots in Hong Kong serve to illustrate how China's current popular unrest mirrors and builds off the same foundation that was created by the students of the 1989 protests. To learn just how bad censorship.
So it was really, really intense. And then when we look at China today, you still have strict control. There was the infamous one child policy that has actually just been lifted, but in which people were only permitted to have one child. You had to have a permit for an extra child. But it also, the problem with it, and I'm not going to get into all of it, we talk a little bit more in class about it. There were all sorts of exceptions to the rules and weird enforcement. However, it did even out the population, but there'll be some more problems with that. And again, we'll talk about that in class. However, one of the big things I have to talk about here is decreasing poverty. And yes, we look at the jobs over in China as sweatshop type jobs and things along that line. And I get it and I completely understand. But if you look at their GNP or their GDP, their gross domestic product, these are the times. So Mao's gone here, and then they start to bring in private businesses, and you look at the massive growth of China's economy and how many goods they're able to make just by 2005, it's absolutely incredible. More and more people have jobs. More and more people have access to school than had ever before in China. And the economy is getting better, but then on the flip side, you still have strict control. You can still get thrown in jail for speaking out against the government. The country is massively polluted, and we'll talk about that more in class, and it's absolutely devastating to the point where you can see the smog from space. It's kind of scary, but China is a power. The run they made, because again, they were a power under Mao Zedong only because they had nukes and they were big, but that was about it. They really didn't have any friends. Now, with their massive economic, and they have the largest army in the world, this is a nation that you can't mess around with. And all of that happened in really just a period of a century. So they're finally back to that point of influence that they had when Zheng He was sailing around the world in the 1400s, and they're going to be there as we continue on. So make sure you get your comments and questions, guys, and we'll talk more in class.